Tales from the Ribble Valley by Cornelius MacManus and George Hull. The Romance of Pebble Bank. When the man with the crooked stick had finished his story, it was nearly closing time. As I didn't like to walk to Preston that night, I arranged for a night's lodging at the farm-like hotel. When the house was closed, I remarked that the story we had just heard was a very romantic one. The landlord answered that it reminded him of one that was even more romantic. It occurred in the place where he was brought up. Where that place is, I cannot with any certainty determine. The landlord called it Pebble Bank, so I suppose that is its name. The landlord is poor at his geography, and I can only conclude that Pebble Bank is near the Ribble, and that Clitheroe is the nearest town to it. Pebble Bank does not appear to have been a very large place. I gathered that 2 handloom weavers and a thatcher lived there, and that a number of agricultural labourers were their neighbours. The policeman who figures in this story was a native of the district. He was one of a family of 7. When he got on the police force, people said it would be his work to keep his brothers in order. This was not said by friends of the family, but by persons who pretended to be solicitors for the welfare of the whole rustic community. When Andrew Tumbrel was appointed to the district in which Pebble Bank was situate, there was much dissatisfaction amongst the inhabitants, especially the lawless sort. He had been their companion in many an escapade, and his knowledge of their habits would help him to make them his victims. Now that Andrew Tumbrel was placed in authority, neither little nor brief, he made up his mind to use it as much as possible to his own advantage. He knew that the first requisite for promotion was the favour of his superiors. Accordingly, he never saw anything wrong in the conduct of those upon whom his superintendent looked with favour, while the common Jack, Tom and Harry, who never had a sovereign to drop into the ready palm of the district inspector, found that they must walk both strictly and straightly if they would keep at peace with the law. Observation taught Andrew Tumbrel that married men got the best places in the force. Therefore he resolved to marry. The woman upon whom he had set his heart, or rather his eye, was the daughter of a cottager at Pebble Bank. Lucy was her father's only child, and Andrew didn't fall in love with her until he had ascertained that her careful father had a good sum of money, which he would one day leave to Lucy. The girl had a lover, but she cast him off at the bidding of the promising young constable. The rival did not care to take his dismissal very quietly, and hence an incident happened which made a dark blot on the hitherto untarnished history of Pebble Bank. The farmer at Glebe Hall had for some time been missing quantities of his poultry. A strict watch had been set, but no trace of the thieves could be found. Andrew looked upon their capture as an important necessity, and spared no pains in his endeavours to discover the marauders. Night after night he prowled about the house. Hour after hour he lay concealed behind the fence. Day after day he diligently traced the prints of the raiders' feet. For some weeks all these labours were in vain, but at length his patience met its reward. The man who had courted Lucy Portland before she knew the policeman was named William Rye. He was the son of a farmer, and his prospects were good. Still, the constable succeeded in persuading Lucy that she would do better by marrying him, and then induced her to cast off her old and tried lover. Lucy's father did not altogether approve of the change in his daughter's affections. Indeed, after a while Lucy began to show signs of repentance, and, as Rye had not ceased to call at her father's house, there was a probability that he would soon oust his unwelcome rival. Great was the surprise of all in Pebble Bank to find that it was William Rye who had taken the poultry from Glebe Hall. No one could suspect him of felony. It was the very last thing in the world of which he could possibly be guilty, and if Andrew Tumbrel hadn't met him with a brace of newly killed fowls in his possession, it would never have been believed that he was the thief. Of course, Rye was sent to jail. When he came out again, he renewed his protestations of innocence. He declared, as he had declared in court, that when the policeman met him and arrested him, he had no poultry in his possession, and that when the fowls were produced in court, he saw them for the first time. Even the culprit's own father did not believe him. Mr. Rye Sr. at once packed his son off to America, there to begin life afresh. Andrew Tumbrel was soon promoted to another district. He married Lucy Portland and took her away to a home in the Fylde. Pebble Bank people seldom heard of them. Correspondence with friends is not one of the arts that has been much cultivated amongst the poorer people of the Ribble Valley. Once or twice Mrs. Tumbrel came over to see her father. Once she had a baby with her, a beautiful child, of whom its grandfather felt very proud. But in time Mr. Portland died, and the memory of Andrew Tumbrel almost faded away from his old home. At length, however, one spring morning, a new tenant came and took up her residence in Mr. Portland's old cottage. No one had heard that she was coming, and she endeavoured to make as little stir as possible now that she had come. However, it soon became known that Mrs. Tumbrel had come back to Pebble Bank again. She had 2 fine children, but she was a widow, and she had her livelihood to earn. She was quick with the needle, and willing at charing and washing. She managed, by working late and early, to earn enough to keep body and soul together. She had few visitors, and none of the neighbours seemed to gain her confidence. The local clergyman called regularly upon her, but even his efforts to relieve her did not for some time meet with the success they deserved. "It appears to me that if you go on like this, you will soon work yourself to death," said the parson to Mrs. Tumbrel. "Ah, well, it can't be helped, but you must try to help it. Think of the children. What will become of them if you die before they are upgrown?" "Ah, I don't know," said the widow with a sigh. For some moments nothing was heard but the sharp click of her needle and thimble. Then the parson broke the silence. "Well, Mrs. Tumbrel, if you'll allow me to suggest, as one who wishes to do good for you and your children, you are not too old to marry again." A sharp cry from the widow's lips. She shook her head mournfully and said, "Never again. My married experience has been too bitter." "May I ask in what regard?" said the clergyman, whose apparent curiosity was merely the effect of anxiety to alleviate, if possible, the sorrow of the friendless widow. "I've never told the secret to anybody, but somebody will have to know some day." Here the widow paused for a while. Her friend did not know what was the right thing to say, so he held his peace. The widow at length repeated her last remark. "Somebody will have to know some day. Still, I dare not tell it now. I dare not tell it now." The parson felt that his interest in the widow was greatly increased. He believed in striking whilst the iron was hot. Accordingly, he used his clerical influence to persuade Mrs. Tumbrel that if she had anything upon her mind which it would be a relief to communicate, he was ready and willing to advise her, and she might be satisfied that her story, if told to him, would be kept under the seal of the strictest secrecy. "I don't know but that the world ought to know it. There's been an innocent man sent to prison and looked on as a thief." "Oh, indeed? In what part of the country did that happen?" "Here, in Pebble Bank." "Here in Pebble Bank?" repeated the mystified parson. He did not remember that anyone from Pebble Bank had ever been convicted of felony. "Yes, sir," answered Mrs. Tumbrel feebly. "It was Will Rye. He was convicted of stealing the hens from Glebe Hall. Well, he never stole those hens. The man who was afterwards married to me got him convicted. Tumbrel was jealous of him. He knew that he wanted me, and he had a spite against him. But it was Tumbrel's own brother that took the fowl. Tumble caught him at it and took them off him. Then he didn't know what to do with them, so he laid the robbery on Will Rye. He told me that before he died. The widow afterwards confided to the parson that they were in great poverty when her husband died. He had been struck off the police force for some time, having finally overreached himself and been detected in some act of villainy. The parson inquired if Mrs. Tumbrel had any relative alive. She had only one, an uncle who went to America a quarter of a century before and was supposed to have made a fortune. His last known address was in Chicago, and to this the good clergyman at once wrote, explaining the circumstances in which Mrs. Tumbrel was placed. Within the month came a remittance for $50. After this, various sums of money were sent from the same source, but, strange to say, not a word, not a scrap of writing accompanied any of the remittance. At length, when the widow had received about a dozen different sums of money from the Golden Continent, she asked the clergyman to write to her uncle and tell him how grateful she was for all his kindness, and how the money sent had been a fortune to her, although it was probably only a drop out of the ocean of the uncle's reputed riches. No reply came to Mrs. Tumbrel, but the parson got a letter with the Chicago postmark upon the envelope. The communication written was as follows: 231 92nd Avenue, Chicago. Reverend Sir, your first letter, addressed to Abram Portland, duly reached me, his executor. Abram Portland died without a cent over 5 years ago. The money I sent to Lucy was in memory of old times. I have outgrown their cursed trick, whichever of them it was that planned it. Never let Lucy know, but that her uncle is sending the money, and as long as I have an arm to earn it, she shall have it. I rely on you to keep this letter a secret, and to let no one in Lancashire know where I am. Yours sincerely, William Rye. Lucy wonders why her uncle never writes. She tells the parson that perhaps a millionaire is too proud to write to a poor widow, but his money comes regularly and is always acceptable.